Well Designed. This is the first of a series of videos where I'll be walking through all the different print settings in Ultimaker Cura, and today we'll be focusing on the quality section. And for a demonstration object here, I've got this little partial sphere that we're going to be slicing. Now, to start off, if you have the latest version of Ultimaker Cura downloaded, which I do, you can see that this is the standard quality that's been selected, and that corresponds to a layer height. And you can see down here in this quality section, the only option I have is layer height. And to display all the different items that are available at layer height, you're going to need to go to Preferences, Configure Cura, go to Settings, and then go from this Basics. I'm going to go to All, and then when I exit out, you'll see all my different quality options available here. And today I want to walk through each of these different items and talk about some things that they may correspond to as far as their settings or other things that may affect. Layer height is a big thing that I will play with in all my different prints. I do have some standards. 0.2 is typical for a lot of my items, but if I do want to go smaller, I can adjust this to 0.12, 0.08, depending on what I want to set this layer height. And this layer height corresponds to every slice. So if we were to slice this here, you can see it's thinking about it, and if we go to our preview option, it'll show all the different slices. So besides our initial layer, which is the second item here, all these slices are now 0.0 millimeters thick. And you can see it's got an estimate of a time here. Now layer height is typically corresponded to quality, because the more layers you have, essentially the more detail you're able to bring out. In the sphere, it's approximating what each layer is. You can really see it at the top here. As you get to the top of the sphere, that layer height starts to get kind of like stepped in. So the more layers you have, the more it can approximate that sphere shape. And that's true of other shapes as well. So that's why layer height is generally considered to be kind of your quality aspect. And the more detailed we get with this, the better object's going to look, but also that means our time's going to go up. So layer height is, again, a big consideration. A lot of my objects I'll print at 0.2 for a general standard, and you can kind of see our time went dramatically down by 0.2, and it still looks pretty good at this approximation. And I will show some objects later here that I printed at 0.1, 0.2, and 0.3. That way you can get kind of a real view of how that looks. And one thing to note here is these settings are also determined by your printer, what your printer is capable of. So a lot of my FDM printers, the smallest I can print are 0.08, but Cura will often let you essentially do dumb things that your printer can't do. Now I put in 0.001, my printer can't go that refined, but Cura is trying to slice that. So one thing to watch out for in all these settings is that Cura is, I'll say, kind of dumb in some ways, in that it will let you put in a setting and it will try its best to come up with that detail. Now I'm going to cancel this since it's thinking too hard trying to do that. So let's just go to 0.01. Again, another setting I know my printer can't hold. Hopefully it slices it at this. In the meantime, while that's slicing, let's talk about initial layer height. So this layer height is all your layers beyond the initial layer, and even for something you find like a sphere or a miniature or something that I'm trying to print, I will still typically do an initial layer height of 0.2. I think that thickness allows for a better bed adhesion squish as the nozzle is going across the bed. Having a little bit more thick material there creates a little bit more tolerance. I think rather than trying to go too fine, if you go too fine, if you're a little bit too far, a little bit too close, that's going to show up in a really small initial layer height. So I think 0.2 or 0.3 is a really good initial layer height. Just make sure you get good bed adhesion without having to really dial in your bed too close. So you can see it did slice here on my layer height with 0.01. Again, now I've got 14 hours runtime versus 15 minutes for 0.2, and this looks great, nice and smooth. However, my printer is not going to be able to print this. So that is something I do want to caution you, that just because Cura accepts these settings doesn't mean that that is a valid setting that your printer can handle. We will reslice this at 0.2. So again, layer height is your layer height after your initial layer. Initial layer height is that very first initial layer thickness. And one thing to watch out for as you set your layer height is you have to think of the throughput on your nozzle. Now, the more throughput on your nozzle with a thicker layer will likely require higher temperatures. If you're pushing through your nozzle at a layer height of 0.1 versus 0.2 versus 0.3, that flow rate's going to change, and your nozzle has to heat up corresponding to that. So we're not going to talk about temperature in this, but just think about that as you adjust your layer height. You may need to increase your temperature or decrease your temperature. And there are certainly prints you can run that will help figure out, if you need to increase or decrease your temperature. And again, I'll cover that more in a different video. But don't consider any of these settings in a vacuum. They will affect other things in Cura. Moving on to line width. This is going to really be determined by your printer again. So this is essentially your nozzle size. So if we were to come down here, you can see this line width, and this also corresponds to wall width. And really that should be your nozzle size. You can play with other settings, or if you can change different nozzles, that's when you'd adjust this. But really all these 0.4s here, I typically leave the same because I only run a 0.4 nozzle. If you run a 0.2, you're probably going to want to change that because then you'll be trying to print a 0.4 layer with a 0.2 nozzle, and it's not going to work very well. Sometimes you might want to change this is if you're really trying to force your printer to try to print some more details. You might be able to get by with adjusting that wall line width to, if we adjust this to a 0.3, oops, 0.3, not, there you go. So you can see that this now has thinner walls than what it had previously. But again, my caution here is that this should normally be set to your nozzle width. Unless you're really trying to figure something different out, line width is always going to be your nozzle width. And that's going to correspond again to your wall thickness or your wall width. So these outer parts are the outer wall line widths, and then inner walls, so represented here by the red is the outer wall, and this green is represented as an inner wall. And again, those should all basically be the same, unless there's some other, I'll say, odd thing that you are trying to work on, then that would become a different setting. And again, all these are also, I'm going to keep it at 0.4. Because again, that's matching my nozzle size. If I'm trying to print something other than my nozzle thickness, it's just going to not make a lot of sense with how my printer is going to think that corresponds in an XY direction. Because this slicer is telling your printer, to go here to form this wall, and if it thinks it's putting down a 0.4 wall, but really your nozzle is a 0.2, you're pulling down a 0.2 wall. When it tries to connect things like these infill lines, this wall is going to be short in one direction or another. So this thickness isn't going to connect there. So that's why I'm saying it should always correspond to your nozzle width. Initial layer width, again, this is typically at 100%. One of the things you can do is try to over extrude, and that kind of relates to all these line widths up here. That's what that was for. Basically, your printer is going to try to know your flow of your nozzle, knowing the feed rate of your filament, knowing your nozzle diameter. It's going to try and make this shape as exact as it can. However, on initial layers, like I talked about here with a thicker layer, on your initial layer height, you may want to try to extrude a little bit more material. You might not care exactly how that bottom layer looks if it extrudes out a little bit extra, because you're more concerned about filling this out. So that's why you might want to do a layer line width of a little bit larger, so that way it tries to put a little bit more material out there and help with your bed adhesion a little bit. And that's how that relates to some of these as well. If you're trying to get maybe a little bit more, do some minor tweaks, That's why you might tweak some of these items. But really, on my day-to-day prints, I'm adjusting layer height and initial layer height. The rest of these I typically leave standard for almost all my prints. Again, unless I'm trying to print maybe a more difficult material, like PETG or something different. Other than that, these settings stay the same. All right, now here we've got some actual printed versions on a turntable here. You can see as the layer heights are indicated, 0.1, 0.3, 0.2 on the back. As the light comes around, you can definitely see how the layer lines, especially if you focus at the top, you can see the difference between those. Take a closer look at those in just a second here. All right, now here we've got 0.1 starting off. You can especially see on the top, it's pretty smooth overall. 0.1 is about as fine as I normally go. 0.2 up next here, you can see that's my standard for if I'm printing terrain for myself or just need quick home items. It still overall looks pretty good. There's definitely some visible layer lines. And again, the top is where you're going to notice that as it tries to make the top of the sphere. That's the biggest issue there. And then 0.3, definitely more visible layer lines. You can see the seam pretty obvious on that. And then overall, still for a sphere, you know, it doesn't look bad, but it's definitely more visible in those layer lines there. And then let's take a look at what it takes to actually make these parts here. Estimate the time. So this is about an hour and a half for 0.1 layers. Quick preview, you can see that I do have some bottom layers there that will be solid and some top layers that will be solid. So now let's change it to 0.2. Now you might think that this should cut the time in half. However, that's just not going to be the case based on some other factors that are in play. But you can see it's pretty close. We went from an hour and a half to about 50 minutes. So again, quality in layers, you can really start to see some of these features up here show up a little bit more at 0.2. But we did cut the time down pretty dramatically. And then if we take it up to 0.3, let's see what that looks like. Again, a lot more apparent up here, but now we're down to 38 minutes. So that's a pretty dramatic time difference. You were almost an hour difference from about 0.1 to 0.3 layer heights. So that's something to keep in mind, that even if you're looking for high quality, time is another factor to consider. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Feel free to post any questions or concerns that you have, and we'll continue with this series some other videos. Thanks very much.